The air in the decaying parlour was thick with the dust of forgotten years, each particle dancing in the thin shafts of afternoon light that pierced the boarded-up windows. 13-year-old Marcus Anthony Ferraro, his knuckles white and his arms trembling from exertion, gave one final heave. The rusted iron bar bit into the groaning floorboard, and with a splintering crack, the rotting wood gave way. Beneath it was not darkness, but the dull metallic sheen of a zinc-lined compartment. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the oppressive silence. Inside lay 3 heavy metal chests, their surfaces cold and indifferent to his touch. With trembling fingers he worked the latch on the first one. It creaked open, revealing not dirt or bones, but neat rolls of waxed cloth. He peeled back a corner, and a glint of impossible light struck his eyes. It was the unmistakable, buttery gleam of gold coins. A breath he didn't know he was holding escaped him in a silent, shuddering sob that shook his entire thin frame. A wave of disbelief so profound it felt like drowning. This story is a testament to the quiet hope that can survive in the most desolate of places, a reminder that value is often hidden where no one else thinks to look. If you believe that every person deserves a chance to be found, let us know where in the world you're listening from in the comments below. Your engagement helps these stories reach others who might need to hear them. Please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel, because the journey of how this boy arrived at this moment is a story of resilience and hidden kindness that you will want to see through to the very end. It's a promise that the weight of this discovery is matched only by the weight of the past. He had to escape to make it here, a past that was closing in on him with terrifying speed. But to understand the true significance of that gold, to comprehend how a runaway orphan, with nothing but the patched clothes his father had made, and 3 single-dollar bills to his name came to stand on the precipice of a $50,000 fortune. We must go back. We must travel back precisely 1 week, to a suffocating Tuesday evening in a cramped apartment in Pittsburgh's Italian immigrant quarter. We must return to the night he overheard a conversation not meant for his ears, the night Marcus realized with a chilling, absolute clarity that his life was worth less than a gambler's debt, and that if he didn't run, he would simply cease to exist. His story doesn't begin with a treasure found, but with the terrifying certainty of a life about to be lost forever. 7 days before he would become the owner of a condemned house, 13-year-old Marcus Anthony Ferraro was just another ghost haunting the industrial heart of Pittsburgh. His world was a perpetual fog of scalding steam and the metallic clang of machinery, a 14-hour-a-day existence inside the oppressive heat of a commercial laundry. From before the sun rose until long after it had set, he fed heavy, damp sheets into the crushing rollers of a mangled press, his thin arms aching with a fatigue that had settled deep into his bones. The air, thick with the chemical scent of lye soap and the damp smell of overworked bodies, was the only air he knew. He moved with the grim, mechanical efficiency of a boy who had learned that to slow down was to invite a sharp word or a stinging slap. This was his life, a relentless cycle of sweat and noise, a penance for a crime he had never committed, a debt being paid to a man he no longer recognized. He was small for his age, a fact accentuated by the threadbare clothes that hung from his wiry frame. His dark hair was perpetually damp with sweat, and his eyes, the same deep brown as his father's, held a quiet, watchful weariness that belonged to someone much older. Every penny he earned, every ounce of strength he expended, was not his own. It was funneled directly to his guardian, his paternal uncle, Vincenzo Ferraro, to feed a hunger that could never be satisfied. Marcus understood the arrangement with the bitter clarity of a child forced into adulthood too soon. He was not a nephew being cared for. He was an asset being liquidated, his youth and labor converted into coins that would be lost on a card table or a horse race by midnight, leaving nothing behind but the lingering stench of cheap cigars. The walk home each evening was a journey through a world he could see but never touch. He navigated the crowded streets of the Italian quarter, a phantom weaving between families sharing meals on their stoops, their laughter and arguments a foreign language of belonging. He saw children his own age kicking a worn leather ball in the street, their shouts echoing with a freedom he could barely remember. He kept his head down, his gaze fixed on the cracked pavement, feeling the profound invisibility of someone who mattered to no one. The city was a vibrant, living thing, but he was merely passing through it. A shadow returning to a darker shadow he was forced to call home, his footsteps quickening not with anticipation, but with a familiar gnawing dread of what would be waiting for him behind the door. Their apartment was a single cramped room on the third floor of a tenement building, a space that always felt starved of fresh air and sunlight. It smelled of boiled cabbage, stale cigarette smoke, and the sour aroma of his uncle's nightly whiskey. A thin mattress in the corner was Marcus's entire domain, a small island in an ocean of his uncle's simmering resentment. The room was a testament to a life in decline, cluttered with yellowed newspapers and empty bottles that Vincenzo never bothered to clear away. It was a cage, and the silence within its walls was often more menacing than the noise, thick with unspoken grievances and the palpable tension of a man perpetually at war with his own bad luck, always searching for someone else to blame for his self-inflicted wounds. For the last 2 years, since the mine collapse had stolen his parents, Marcus had lived by the volatile whims of Vincenzo Ferraro. He had watched the uncle he vaguely remembered from family holidays transform into a bitter, hollowed-out man, consumed by the gambler's twin fevers of desperate hope and crushing despair. Each night was a careful negotiation. Marcus would enter the apartment silently, his senses on high alert, trying to gauge his uncle's state from the slump of his shoulders or the smell of liquor on his breath. A win at the track might mean a rare slice of meat for dinner. A loss, which was far more common, meant a dinner of stale bread, and the high probability of a rage-fueled tirade about the opportunities he had wasted and the burdens he was forced to carry. In the suffocating darkness of his corner, Marcus would retreat into the only sanctuary he had left, his memory. He would conjure the image of his father, a tailor with calloused, gentle hands, humming an old tune as he worked his sewing machine. He could almost smell the comforting scent of wool and chalk from his father's small shop. He would remember his mother's warm laugh and the way she would brush the hair from his eyes, her touch a promise of safety and unconditional love. These memories were both a comfort and a torture, a glimpse of a life so completely shattered that it felt like a story about someone else. The warmth of that past life made the cold reality of his present existence feel even more unbearable, a constant, aching reminder of everything he had lost. His only physical connection to that world was the patched wool vest and sturdy trousers he wore every day. His father had made them for him just before he died, the stitches a testament to a craftsman's skill and a parent's love. Marcus would run his fingers over the seams, feeling the careful, even work, a tangible piece of the man who had believed his son deserved the best he could offer. The fabric was worn thin in places and patched at the elbows and knees, but it was a suit of armor. It was proof that he was Marcus Anthony Ferraro, the son of a proud tailor, not just the nameless laundry boy or the inconvenient burden his uncle saw. In the dead of night, it was this vest that he would cling to, a fragile shield against the encroaching darkness. Life with Vincenzo was a pendulum swinging between neglect and aggression. The cycle was predictable. A period of losses would make his uncle desperate, his eyes scanning the small apartment for anything of value. Marcus learned to hide the few keepsakes he had of his mother, a small silver locket, a book of poetry, after his uncle sold her wedding band for a pittance, money that was gone by the next morning. The betrayal of that act had severed the last fraying thread of familial duty Marcus felt. He understood then that he was living with a stranger, a man who would burn down his own house for the warmth of the fire, heedless of who was trapped inside. Vincenzo was not his protector, he was the wolf at the door. This slow, grinding erosion of his spirit had left Marcus isolated and silent. He had no friends, for there was no time to make any. He had no education beyond the simple arithmetic his father had taught him, for his uncle had pulled him from school the week after the funeral. His world had shrunk to the exhausting, repetitive motions of his job and the tense, watchful silence of his home. He had become an expert observer, noticing the subtle shift in his uncle's posture that signaled danger, learning the precise timing of when to speak and when to disappear into the background. He was surviving, but he was not living. Hope was a luxury he couldn't afford, a flickering candle flame in a room with a constant, dangerous draft. Yet, even in this bleak landscape, a tiny seed of defiance had taken root. Over 6 painstaking months, Marcus had managed to save $3, one bill at a time, skimming them from the rare moments his uncle was too drunk or too jubilant to count the day's wages with his usual miserly precision. He kept the bills folded into a tiny, tight square, hidden behind a loose brick in the wall next to his cot. He didn't know what he was saving for, not yet. It was simply an act of self-preservation, a secret declaration that some part of him, however small, still belonged to himself. Those $3 were a private rebellion, a whisper in the suffocating silence that said he was worth more than nothing. The true breaking point, the moment the slow, grinding erosion of his life gave way to a sudden, terrifying fracture, arrived on a Tuesday evening. Vincenzo returned later than usual, the familiar sour scent of whiskey on his breath mingling with a new, sharper odor of desperation. He didn't slam the door or curse his luck as he usually did after a significant loss. Instead, he moved with a chilling quietness, a predatory stillness that set every nerve in Marcus's body on edge. He sat heavily at the small rickety table, the gas lamp casting long dancing shadows that made his face look like a hollowed-out mask. The silence in the room was different tonight. It wasn't the absence of noise, but the presence of something heavy and final, a decision that had been made in a place far from this suffocating room and was now being brought home to be executed. His uncle finally looked at him, his eyes dark and empty of any recognizable emotion. There was no anger, no pity, just the cold, flat gaze of a man looking at an object, a problem to be solved. He spoke in a low, measured tone that was far more menacing than his usual drunken shouting. He informed Marcus that he had made an arrangement for him, a new life away from the city. He used words like opportunity and apprenticeship, painting a picture of a future where Marcus would learn a trade at a textile factory in New Jersey. Each word was a carefully chosen lie, a thin coat of paint over a rotten core, and Marcus felt the falsehood in his bones. The air grew thin and a knot of ice formed in his stomach, a cold premonition that this was not a departure, but a disposal. Marcus tried to ask a question, his voice a mere whisper, but Vincenzo raised a hand, silencing him with a gesture of absolute authority. The factory, his uncle continued, was a place where a boy could make something of himself, where hard work was rewarded. He spoke of structure and discipline as if they were gifts, not the bars of a cage. He did not mention pay or freedom, or what would happen to a boy who got sick or injured so far from anyone who knew his name. The unspoken details hung in the air between them, more powerful than the words themselves. The conversation was not a discussion, it was a verdict being read. Marcus was not being offered a choice. He was being informed of his sentence, a transfer from one form of servitude to another, more permanent one. Then came the timeline, delivered with the same detached finality. "You leave in 3 days," Vincenzo stated, his gaze unwavering. The words were not just a piece of information. They were a countdown, a clock that had just started ticking inside Marcus's head. 3 days, 72 hours. The world outside the grimy apartment window, with its distant symphony of streetcars, vendors' calls, and children's laughter, suddenly seemed to recede, becoming a muffled, inaccessible memory of a life he was about to be forcibly ejected from. Each second that passed now felt precious and terrifying, a grain of sand slipping through an hourglass, bringing him closer to an unknown but deeply feared precipice. The abstract dread he had lived with for 2 years had just been given a name and a date. Later that night, long after his uncle had collapsed into a drunken sleep, Marcus lay on his cot, his eyes wide open in the oppressive darkness, feigning a rest that would not come. The sound of the apartment door creaking open sent a jolt of pure adrenaline through him. He remained perfectly still, his breathing shallow, listening as a heavy set of footsteps entered the room. He recognized the low, gravelly voice that followed as belonging to Mr. Gallo, one of his uncle's most persistent creditors, a man known for his ruthless methods of collection. They thought he was asleep. They spoke in hushed conspiratorial tones, believing their conversation was shrouded by the night, unaware that every single word was a nail being hammered into the coffin of his childhood. It was in that moment, listening from the shadows, that the vague, sanitized threat of an apprenticeship was stripped bare, revealing the brutal truth beneath. Vincenzo, his voice no longer detached but slick with the false pride of a successful negotiator, described the deal he had made. He never once used the word nephew. Instead, he referred to Marcus as the boy, an asset, a piece of property to be liquidated. He boasted about the price he had secured, $50. The sum was so small, so insultingly insignificant, it stole the air from Marcus's lungs. His entire life, his future, his very being, had been valued at $50, less than the cost of a decent suit. A sum that his uncle would likely lose on a single hand of cards before the week was out. The creditor, Gallo, asked a question, his voice laced with pragmatic suspicion. He wanted to know if there would be any trouble, any family members who might come looking for the boy later on. Vincenzo's reply was the blow that shattered Marcus's world completely. "He's a strong, obedient boy," his uncle slurred, the words a grotesque parody of a character reference. "And the best part? No family to ask questions." That single sentence was a death sentence. It was the chilling, unequivocal confirmation that he was not just being sent away, he was being deliberately erased. He was a loose end being tied up, a burden being cast off into an abyss from which no one was expected to hear from him ever again. He was an orphan, and that vulnerability was not a reason for protection, but his primary selling point. The sharp, metallic clink of coins being counted onto the table was the final tangible proof. It was the sound of a transaction being finalized, a down payment on his life. The sound cut through the silence of the room, each coin a punctuation mark on the sentence that had just been passed. After a few more quiet words, Gallo left, his heavy footsteps descending the stairs, leaving behind a silence that was now filled with a new and monstrous understanding. Vincenzo, oblivious, soon began to snore, the sound a grotesque counterpoint to the frantic, silent screaming inside Marcus's own head. The man who was supposed to be his guardian, his only remaining family, had sold him like livestock. Lying on his thin mattress, Marcus felt a profound, paralyzing cold seep into his bones, a cold that had nothing to do with the night air. The words, "no family to ask questions," echoed and re-echoed in the chambers of his mind. He pictured the factory his uncle had mentioned, a place he had only heard about in fearful whispers from other working boys. They called it the Grey Mill, a place of perpetual noise, of air so thick with cotton dust it was hard to breathe, and of machines that were notoriously unforgiving of a moment's inattention. Boys went there, but they never seemed to come back. They were consumed by the work, their youth ground down into profit until there was nothing left. He knew then, with an unshakable certainty, that there was no one to appeal to. He could not run to the police, for what would he say? That his legal guardian had found him a job? He could not cry out to the neighbors, who were too consumed with their own struggles to intervene in the affairs of a quiet, withdrawn boy and his gambling uncle. He was invisible to the world, a ghost in the machine of the city, and his disappearance would go unnoticed. The system, the community, the very structure of society that was meant to offer some semblance of protection, had failed him completely. He was utterly and terrifyingly alone, trapped in a cage with the door about to be locked permanently. The initial wave of shock and terror did not last. It receded, leaving behind a strange and unfamiliar clarity, a cold, hard resolve that settled deep within him. This was not a problem that could be endured or a hardship that could be weathered. This was an ending. Staying in this apartment for 3 more days meant allowing himself to be shipped off to a place that would surely kill him, whether quickly in an accident or slowly through exhaustion and disease. The choice was no longer between a miserable life and an unknown one. It was a stark choice between certain erasure and the slimmest, most desperate chance at survival. He had to act. The fear did not vanish, but it transformed. It became fuel. Every sense in his body sharpened. He could hear the precise rhythm of his uncle's snoring, feel the rough texture of the wool vest his father had made for him, and see the faint outline of the loose brick in the wall beside his cot. That brick, which had for months been the hiding place for a vague and uncertain hope, now represented something concrete, an escape. The 3 $1 bills tucked behind it were no longer just a secret stash. They were his only weapon, his only resource, his only ticket out. The countdown had begun, but he would not wait for it to reach 0. He would run. He had to. The silence that descended after Gallo's departure was a living entity, a suffocating weight that pressed down on Marcus, making it impossible to breathe. In the darkness, he was no longer a boy lying on a cot. He was a witness, a victim, and now a fugitive in his own mind. The chilling finality of his uncle's words, "No family to ask questions," had severed the last microscopic filament of hope that things might somehow get better. It was a declaration that his existence was an inconvenience to be erased. The terror that had initially frozen him began to thaw, replaced by a cold, sharp-edged clarity that was entirely new. It was the clarity of an animal caught in a trap, realizing that to remain still was to guarantee death. Staying was not an option. Waiting for the next 3 days to pass was simply waiting for his executioner. The decision wasn't made with logic or careful consideration. It was a primal, instantaneous reaction, a cellular-level command that screamed through his entire being, "Run." This newfound resolve did not extinguish his fear. Instead, it repurposed it, transforming the paralyzing dread into a frantic, focused energy that sharpened his senses. Every creak of the floorboards, every distant shout from the street below, every wheezing snore from his uncle became a piece of critical information. He lay perfectly still for what felt like an eternity, his mind racing, mapping out the geography of the small room as if it were a hostile landscape. The rickety chair by the door was a potential noise trap. The loose floorboard near the stove was a hazard to be avoided. His entire world, which for 2 years had been a static prison, was now a dynamic puzzle he had to solve to survive. He was no longer a passive occupant of this space. He was a strategist planning a breakout, his every thought dedicated to the single, overwhelming goal of getting out before the sun rose. His plan was born of desperation, simple and terrifyingly fragile. He would wait until the deepest part of the night, that dead, silent hour, just before the first signs of dawn. When his uncle's drunken sleep was at its most profound and unshakable, he had learned the rhythms of Vincenzo's oblivion, the way his breathing would settle into a heavy, predictable cadence after the initial thrashing and muttering subsided. That would be his window. He would take nothing but the $3 hidden in the wall and the clothes on his back. He had no destination, no ally, no knowledge of the world beyond the few blocks he traversed between the laundry and this suffocating room. But the terrifying unknown of the city streets was infinitely preferable to the horrifying certainty of the grey mill. The absence of a plan for tomorrow was a luxury compared to the guarantee of no tomorrows at all. With painstaking slowness, Marcus rolled from his cot, his bare feet meeting the cold, gritty floorboards without a sound. He moved like a phantom, his small, thin frame an advantage in the cluttered space. He navigated the short distance to the wall beside his mattress, his heart a frantic, muffled drum against his ribs. His fingers, trembling slightly, found the familiar outline of the loose brick. He worked it free with an agonizing patience, the scraping of mortar on wood sounding like a gunshot in the silence. He held his breath, listening to the steady, rumbling snore from across the room. It didn't change. He reached into the small, dark cavity, his fingers closing around the tightly folded square of paper. The 3 $1 bills felt both impossibly flimsy and as heavy as gold. The sum total of his secret rebellion, his entire arsenal for the war he was about to wage for his own life. Just as he slipped the bills into the deep pocket of his trousers, a sound from the other side of the room sent a jolt of ice through his veins. Vincenzo had shifted on his mattress, the rusty springs groaning in protest. A low, guttural moan escaped his uncle's lips, a sound of someone stirring in the depths of a bad dream. Marcus froze instantly, his body rigid. His eyes locked on the shadowy form across the room. He didn't dare breathe. The seconds stretched into an eternity, each one a lifetime of pure, unadulterated terror. He was certain he had been discovered, that any moment a hand would grab him, and his one chance would be gone forever. But then, with a final, shuddering sigh, his uncle rolled onto his other side, and the heavy, rhythmic snoring resumed. The immediate danger had passed, but it left Marcus shaking, the fragile courage he had mustered nearly shattered by the close call. He took a moment to steady himself, drawing a slow, silent breath and clutching the worn fabric of his vest. The familiar texture of the wool stitched by his father's hands was a grounding force in the swirling chaos of his fear. This vest was more than just clothing. It was a legacy, a tangible piece of the love and protection he had lost. It was a reminder that he was not just the boy his uncle was selling. He was Marcus Anthony Ferraro, the son of a man who had created things of value and substance. In that moment, he wasn't just running from Vincenzo. He was running towards the memory of his father, towards the idea that he too was worth something, that his life had a value that could not be measured in $50. This silent communion with his past gave him the strength to take the next step. The hours that followed were the longest of his life. He sat on the edge of his cot, perfectly still, a sentinel at his own vigil. He watched the sliver of moonlight visible through the grimy window crawl slowly across the far wall, a celestial clock marking the agonizingly slow march towards his departure. Every distant sound, the clatter of a dropped bottle, the mournful whistle of a train made him flinch. Doubt, a cold and insidious serpent, began to coil in his stomach. What was he doing? How could a 13-year-old boy with $3 survive on the streets of a city that had already swallowed so many? The thought of failure, of being caught and dragged back, was almost as terrifying as the thought of the factory. He had to force the images from his mind, focusing instead on the sound of his uncle's breathing, the one constant that tethered him to his purpose. He took one last sweeping look at the room. The sight of it, the squalor and the decay, the scattered bottles and the lingering smell of stale whiskey, did not inspire sadness or nostalgia. It inspired a profound and final sense of detachment. This was not his home, it had only ever been his cage. There was nothing here for him to miss, no good memories to cling to. His real home existed only in his memory, in the scent of his father's tailor shop and the warmth of his mother's kitchen. This room was a tomb, and he was about to escape it. His silent goodbye was not to a place, but to a period of his life, a final, resolute closing of a chapter, filled with nothing but pain and neglect. He was leaving the ghost of his former self behind. The signal came, as he knew it would, in the form of a low, distant rumble. It was the sound of the first delivery wagon of the day, its iron-rimmed wheels clattering over the cobblestones several streets away. It was a sound that marked the transition from the dead of night to the very beginning of the city's awakening, the precise moment he had been waiting for. The world outside was beginning to stir, providing a thin veil of noise that would cover his escape. It was now or never. A surge of adrenaline washed over him, banishing the last vestiges of doubt. He rose from the cot, his movements fluid and silent, every muscle in his body coiled with a singular, desperate intent. The time for waiting, for fearing, for thinking was over. He crept towards the door, his path memorized, his steps light as a whisper. He paused beside his uncle's mattress, listening for one final reassuring moment to the deep, unbroken rhythm of his sleep. The man was lost to the world, oblivious to the monumental act of defiance happening just a few feet away. Marcus reached the apartment door, his small hand hovering for a second over the tarnished brass knob. It was the final barrier between his past and his future, between certain doom and a sliver of a chance. He took one last shallow breath, the stale air of the room filling his lungs for the last time. His fingers closed around the cold, solid metal of the knob, the tangible reality of his escape, sending a tremor of both terror and exhilarating hope through his entire body. He turned the knob with the agonizing slowness of a bomb technician, his entire being focused on the single point of contact between his hand and the cold brass. The mechanism inside protested with a low, metallic groan, a sound that seemed to scream through the suffocating silence of the apartment. Marcus froze, his heart leaping into his throat, his eyes fixed on the motionless lump that was his uncle. He counted the steady, rumbling snores, 1, 2, 3, waiting for any change in the rhythm, any sign of waking. Nothing. The sound had been swallowed by the night, a secret kept between him and the door. Exhaling a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, he applied pressure again, and this time the latch clicked free with a soft, final snap. The door was open, revealing a sliver of the deeper, colder darkness of the tenement hallway beyond. The air that met him in the corridor was different, thick with the ghosts of other people's lives, the lingering scent of boiled cabbage from the floor below, the faint trace of coal smoke, and an underlying dampness that clung to the peeling wallpaper. He slipped through the opening and gently pulled the door until it was almost closed. not daring to let it click shut and risk a second, more definitive noise. Now he was in the open, a trespasser in the common space. Every floorboard was a potential traitor, each one threatening to creak and announce his presence to the entire building. He moved on the balls of his bare feet, his arms held slightly out from his sides for balance, his breath a shallow, controlled rhythm in his chest. The silence was his enemy, and his only shield, a fragile cloak he had to wear without tearing. His descent down the 3 flights of stairs was a slow, terrifying ballet. He tested each wooden step with his toe before committing his full weight, learning the unique groan and complaint of each one. He stayed close to the wall, where the boards were better supported and less likely to betray him. As he passed the second-floor landing, the sound of a door opening down the hall sent a bolt of pure ice through his veins. He flattened himself into a dark alcove, a space so shallow he could feel the rough, cold plaster against his back. A man in an undershirt shuffled past, his eyes half closed on his way to the shared lavatory at the end of the hall, passing within feet of Marcus without a glance. The man's weary sigh was the loudest sound in the world, and Marcus held his breath until the lavatory door clicked shut, the close call leaving him trembling. The final barrier was the heavy main door on the ground floor, a slab of wood and iron that separated the tenement from the city street. A thick, rusted iron bolt secured it for the night. This was not a challenge of stealth, but of strength and control. He wrapped both his small, calloused hands around the cold, gritty metal of the bolt handle. He pulled, not with a sudden jerk, but with a steady, excruciating pressure. His muscles screamed in protest, his knuckles white with the strain. The bolt resisted, then began to move, scraping against its housing with a low, grinding shriek that set his teeth on edge. He paused, listened, then pulled again, the sound of metal on metal, a torturous symphony that seemed to last an eternity, each inch a monumental victory against his prison. Finally, with a soft, metallic thud, the bolt slid fully open. The final lock was undone. He pushed the massive door, which groaned on its hinges, opening it just wide enough for his thin frame to slip through. The first touch of the outside air was a shock to his system. It was cold, damp, and carried the industrial scent of the city, a mixture of coal dust, river water, and the distant metallic tang of the steel mills. This was the air of freedom, but it was a harsh and unforgiving freedom. He was out. He was a ghost who had just slipped through the walls of his own tomb. He stood for a single, disoriented second on the stone step, a solitary figure under the faint, indifferent light of a gas lamp at the corner of the street. He did not run. His instincts screamed at him to flee, to put as much distance as possible between himself and that building, but a deeper, colder part of his mind knew that running would draw attention. Instead, he forced himself into a steady walk, his head down, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. He became just another shadow in a city full of them, hugging the dark recesses of the buildings, his bare feet making almost no sound on the grimy cobblestones. The city at this hour was a different creature, a sleeping giant whose familiar daytime face was now a mask of dark, empty windows and long, menacing shadows. Every alleyway was a potential dead end, every distant noise a possible threat. He was an ant navigating a world not built for him. Panic flared when he turned a corner and saw a figure leaning against a wall at the far end of the street, the orange glow of a cigarette tip pulsing in the darkness. Without a second thought, Marcus ducked into the first available opening, a narrow, reeking alley between 2 brick buildings. The stench of rotting garbage and sour milk was overwhelming, and he pressed his back against the cold, slimy brick, making himself as small as possible. He listened, his heart hammering against his ribs, as the slow, heavy footsteps of the man approached his hiding spot. They paused, just for a moment, and Marcus was certain he'd been seen. He held his breath, preparing for a shout for a hand to grab him, but the footsteps resumed, continuing down the street and fading into the night, leaving him alone with the smell of decay. The wave of relief left him weak, his legs trembling. He slid down the wall until he was crouched in the filth, the sharp reality of his situation crashing down on him with suffocating force. He was 13 years old, alone in the middle of the night with 3 $1 bills in his pocket. He had no destination, no plan, no one in the entire world who knew or cared where he was. The sheer scale of his vulnerability was a physical weight, a crushing pressure on his chest. For a fleeting, desperate moment, the thought of returning to the apartment, to the known misery, seemed almost comforting compared to this terrifying absolute freedom. But then the echo of his uncle's voice returned. No family to ask questions. And it was like a splash of ice water hardening his resolve and pushing him back to his feet. He began moving again, this time with a more urgent, determined stride. His goal was no longer just to escape the building, but to escape the entire neighborhood, to lose himself in the vast, anonymous grid of the city. He walked east, away from the Italian Quarter, using the faint, perpetual orange glow of the steel mills on the horizon as his compass. He crossed silent intersections and navigated empty market squares, a solitary traveler in a desolate landscape. He was acutely aware of his own smallness, the sound of his own breathing, the soft slap of his bare feet on the stone. He was a ship without a rudder, cast into a vast and indifferent ocean, driven forward only by the storm he had left behind. The initial rush of adrenaline began to wear off, replaced by a deep, invasive cold that seeped through his thin clothes and into his bones. The damp night air was a constant chilling presence, and he wrapped his arms around himself, his father's wool vest offering a meager but welcome layer of insulation. A new and more immediate enemy began to make itself known: hunger. The gnawing emptiness in his stomach was a dull, persistent ache, a reminder that his freedom had a cost, and that survival was a battle that would have to be fought not just once, but every single hour of every day. The city was not a sanctuary. It was a wilderness, and he had to learn its rules quickly or be consumed by it. His exhaustion made him clumsy. As he hurried across a deserted street, his foot caught on a raised cobblestone, sending him stumbling forward. He caught himself before he fell, but the sound of his shoe scuffing loudly on the stone echoed in the pre-dawn stillness. The noise seemed as loud as a gunshot. He froze instantly, crouching low in the middle of the street, his head whipping around, searching the dark windows and shadowed doorways for any sign that he had been heard. But there was only the low, mournful whistle of a distant train and the whisper of the wind funneling between the buildings. He was still alone. The scare, however, taught him a valuable lesson. Every step was a risk, every sound a potential betrayal. As the eastern sky began to soften from black to a deep bruised purple, signaling the imminent arrival of dawn, he knew he needed to find a place to hide. To be seen on the streets at sunrise, a boy alone and disheveled, would be to invite questions he could not answer. He spotted a market square where vendors were beginning to set up their stalls for the day. In a corner behind a towering stack of empty wooden fruit crates was a small protected space, shielded from view on three sides. He slipped into the narrow gap, the rough wood scraping against his clothes. It wasn't shelter, and it offered no warmth, but it was concealment. He curled into a tight ball, pulling his knees to his chest, the rough wool of his vest a familiar anchor in a world that had become utterly alien. He had survived the night. He was free, and he was utterly, terrifyingly lost. The piece of paper in his hand, the official deed from the auction, felt impossibly flimsy, a fragile claim against the immense skeletal structure that loomed before him. For 7 days, he had been a ghost in the city's alleys, but now he was a property owner. The 2-story Victorian house was a monument to decay, its paint peeling like sunburnt skin, its windows boarded up like hollow, blind eyes. He used the large rusted key the auctioneer had given him, a piece of metal that felt ancient and significant. With a groan of protest from the long dormant lock, the heavy oak door swung inward, releasing a sigh of cold, stale air that smelled of trapped centuries, of damp plaster and the fine, dry scent of powdered wood. He stepped across the threshold, not just into a building, but into the first space that was truly his, a sanctuary born from a $3 bet against total despair. He made his way into what must have been the main parlor, a vast, high-ceilinged room plunged into a perpetual twilight by the boarded windows. Thin, brilliant shafts of sunlight pierced the gloom, illuminating swirling universes of dust motes that danced in the still air. The grand furniture that remained was shrouded in white cloths, making the pieces look like sleeping giants covered in snow. The silence here was different from the silence of the alleys. It was a deep, profound quiet, the accumulated silence of forgotten years. A grand fireplace with a marble mantel stood cold and imposing against one wall, its hearth filled with the ashes of a long-extinguished fire. This was his refuge, his castle of ruin. For the first time in a week he was not exposed, not vulnerable to the elements or the casual cruelty of the streets. He was home, in the most broken and desolate sense of the word. An exhaustion so profound, it felt like a physical weight settled over him, a debt his body had been accumulating for 7 sleepless nights. He sank to the floor in the center of the room, his legs simply giving out, a puppet whose strings had finally been cut. The rough, dusty floorboards against his back were a comfort, a solid, tangible reality. He was inside. He was safe, at least for now. The constant gnawing tension that had been his companion for 2 years and had become a sharp, screaming terror in the last week finally began to recede, leaving behind a dull, throbbing ache in his bones and his soul. He closed his eyes, allowing the heavy silence of the house to wash over him, car-tide pulling him under into a state that was not quite sleep, but a deep, dreamless rest where for a few precious moments he had nothing to run from. As he lay there, drifting in the quiet darkness, the memory of his father's voice surfaced, as clear and steady as if he were standing in the room beside him. Every building tells a story to those who listen, Marcus. The words were not just a comforting echo of the past. They were an instruction, a purpose. He had not come here simply to hide. He had come here because something deep inside him, a legacy of his father's belief in the hidden value of things, had responded to the description of this condemned place. He sat up, the exhaustion pushed back by a new, quiet resolve. He was the owner of this house, but he was also its student. He had to learn its secrets. He rose to his feet, his gaze sweeping the room with a new intensity, no longer seeing just decay, but seeing a puzzle, a history waiting to be read. He began to explore with a careful, tactile curiosity, running his hands over the peeling wallpaper and the cold, smooth marble of the mantelpiece. He walked the perimeter of the room, testing the floorboards with the heel of his foot, listening to their individual groans and creaks. Most were solid, but near the fireplace, one board responded differently. It didn't squeak. When he pressed down on it, it produced a low, dull thud, a sound of wood hitting something that wasn't a wooden joist. It gave way just a fraction of an inch more than its neighbors. He knelt, his heart beginning a slow, heavy beat of anticipation. He ran his fingers along the edges, feeling for a seam, a sign that this board was different for a reason. It was cut cleaner than the others, its edges less splintered, as if it had been designed to be removed. He needed leverage, a tool to speak the house's language. After a brief search through the debris in a corner of the room, his fingers closed around a long, heavy piece of metal, a rusted iron fireplace poker, its handle ornate but its tip blunted by time. The bar felt solid and purposeful in his hands, a stark contrast to the trembling he felt inside. He returned to the loose floorboard, his breath catching in his throat. This was the moment, a wild, irrational hope, something he hadn't dared to feel for 2 long years, flickered to life within his chest. It was a terrifying sensation, because hope could be crushed, and he wasn't sure he could survive another disappointment. But the alternative, to do nothing, to simply accept this ruin as the end of his story, was unbearable. He wedged the tip of the iron bar into the seam and took a deep, steadying breath. He put his entire weight into the effort, his thin arms trembling with a strain they hadn't felt even in the 14-hour days at the laundry. The old wood groaned in protest, the sound echoing in the vast, silent parlor. Rusted nails shrieked as they were slowly, reluctantly pulled from the joists. Sweat beaded on his forehead and trickled down his temples, stinging his eyes. For a moment, it seemed the board would not yield, that it would splinter into useless pieces before revealing whatever lay beneath. But he gave one final, desperate heave, channeling all the fear and exhaustion and fragile hope of the past week into that single motion. The rusted iron bar bit deeper, the groaning rose to a sharp, splintering crack, and the rotting wood finally gave way, breaking free with a suddenness that sent him stumbling backward. The air that rose from the opening was different, cool and dry, with a faint metallic scent, like the smell of a storm on the wind. He crept forward, his heart hammering against his ribs, and peered into the darkness he had created. It was not the damp, spider-webbed crawlspace he had expected to see. It was not the packed earth of a foundation. Instead, his eyes met the dull, indifferent sheen of a zinc-lined compartment, a perfectly constructed metal box set into the floor. The sight was so utterly alien, so completely outside the realm of possibility, that for a long moment he could only stare, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. In the center of the compartment, nestled like eggs in a metallic nest, were 3 heavy metal chests, their surfaces cold and dark, guardians of a secret the house had held for generations. This was it. The moment our story began. He lowered himself to his knees beside the hole in the floor, his movements slow and reverent. His hands were shaking so badly he had to press them against his legs to steady them. He reached into the compartment, his fingers brushing against the cold, unyielding surface of the nearest chest. It was heavy, far heavier than it should have been if it were empty. With a surge of adrenaline, he worked the rusted latch, his fumbling fingers clumsy with anticipation. The lid creaked open, revealing not dirt or bones or forgotten papers, but neat, tight rolls of waxed cloth. He peeled back a corner of the topmost roll, and a glint of impossible buttery light struck his eyes. It was the unmistakable gleam of gold coins. A breath he didn't know he was holding escaped him in a silent, shuddering sob that shook his entire thin frame, a wave of disbelief so profound it felt like drowning in hope. He sat there for a long time on the dusty floor, the cold reality of the gold coins radiating a strange, impossible warmth through the parlor's gloom. He counted 100 coins from the first chest, their weight in his hands, a solid, undeniable truth that his mind still struggled to accept. Each $20 piece was a universe of possibility, a shield against the hunger and cold that had been his only companions. He moved to the second chest, his movements now more deliberate, less frantic. Prying it open, he found it identical to the first, filled with the same tightly wrapped rolls of waxed cloth, each one concealing another fortune in minted gold. The sheer scale of the discovery was beginning to settle in, not as a sudden shock, but as a slow, creeping tide of understanding that threatened to overwhelm him. This was not just enough money to survive, it was enough to build a new world, a fortress against the memory of his uncle and the suffocating scent of the laundry. The weight of it was both liberating and terrifying, a responsibility he had never imagined carrying. He approached the third and final chest with a different kind of anticipation. It felt lighter than the others, and when he shook it gently, he heard not just the muffled clinking of coins, but a softer, more subtle rustling sound. A flicker of a new emotion, a deep and profound curiosity replaced the initial desperate hope for survival. There was something more here. The latches on this chest were less corroded, and they gave way with a smoother, more yielding click. He lifted the heavy lid, his breath held tight in his chest. Inside, nestled atop the familiar rolls of gold, was a small, flat package wrapped carefully in dark, waterproof oilskin and tied with a simple twine string. It was placed with an unmistakable deliberateness, a clear message that this object, above all the gold beneath it, was meant to be found first. It was the heart of the secret, the voice of the house that his father had told him to listen for, and he knew, with an instinct that transcended logic, that what it contained would be more valuable than all the coins combined. His fingers, still trembling slightly, fumbled with the knot in the old twine. It crumbled to dust between his fingertips. He carefully unfolded the stiff, cracked layers of oilskin, revealing what lay within. It was a thick envelope of heavy vellum, its flap sealed with a dark red wax that bore the intricate impression of a family crest. The paper was yellowed with age, but had been perfectly preserved from the dampness of the earth by its protective wrapping. Through the semi-translucent paper, he could see the faint, dark lines of elegant cursive script. This was a letter, a message from the past, a story left behind by the person who had buried this impossible treasure. He felt a sense of reverence settle over him, a feeling that he was trespassing on sacred ground. He was not a discoverer, but an intruder, an accidental recipient of a history that was never meant for him, and the weight of that realization was heavier than any of the gold he held. Before attempting to break the seal, he noticed another object tucked within the folds of the oilskin, separate from the letter. It was a small cardboard-backed photograph, its edges softened and worn with time. He picked it up with a tenderness he hadn't felt in years. It depicted a man with a thick mustache and kind, serious eyes, his arm wrapped around a woman with a gentle smile. Standing before them were two small children, a boy and a girl, dressed in their finest clothes. They were a family, captured in a moment of quiet, unassuming happiness, their faces frozen in a time before this gold had been hidden, before their story had been interrupted. Marcus stared at the image, a sharp, unexpected ache piercing his chest. He saw in their faces the echo of his own lost family, the warmth of his mother's smile, the protective strength in his father's gaze. This treasure was not an abstract fortune. It belonged to these people. It was their hope, their future, their love made tangible. He carefully broke the wax seal on the letter, his fingers gentle so as not to tear the fragile paper. The script inside was dense and written in German, a language he could not read, but the meaning began to reveal itself through context and the few words he could decipher. He saw dates clearly written, 1893, and a name signed at the bottom with a confident, looping flourish, Klaus Richter. The letter, as the narrative of its words unfolded in his mind through a universal language of intent, told a story of a man caught in a storm not unlike his own. Klaus Richter was a merchant, a man who had built a life for his family with his own two hands, much like Marcus's father, the tailor. He wrote of the great banking panic, a time of fear and collapse when the systems people trusted had turned to dust overnight, a world where paper money became worthless paper and fortunes vanished in the blink of an eye. Klaus wrote not with greed, but with the desperate protective love of a father and a husband. He explained his decision to convert his entire life savings into solid gold, the one thing he believed would endure. He did not trust the failing banks or the panicked politicians. He trusted something more fundamental. He trusted the earth beneath the home he had built, the house that had sheltered his family and kept them safe. He described how he had worked at night, by candlelight, to construct the zinc-lined compartment, a secret vault to protect his family's future from the chaos of the outside world. He was not hiding money from the government. He was preserving a future for the people in the photograph, every coin a promise that he would see them through the crisis, that their lives would not be shattered by the failures of others. The letter detailed his plan with heartbreaking clarity. He would wait for the panic to subside, for stability to return, and then he would unearth the chests. The money was to be their passage back to their extended family in Germany, a way to escape the economic turmoil and start anew in a place of safety and community. It was a meticulous, loving plan, a bridge built of gold that would carry his family from a present of fear to a future of security. As Marcus absorbed the weight of these intentions, he felt a profound connection to this man he had never met. Klaus Richter was not a ghost, he was a protector, a man who had faced the collapse of his world and had taken decisive, courageous action to save the people he loved, a choice Marcus understood with every fiber of his being. But the story took a tragic, devastating turn. In a few short, spare sentences, the letter explained the cruel twist of fate that had rendered his careful plans meaningless. Just weeks after hiding the gold, before he had the chance to tell even his wife the secret location, a wave of yellow fever swept through their part of the city. Klaus Richter, the strong and careful protector, was taken by the illness. The secret of the treasure, the key to his family's future, died with him. His wife and children, left with nothing, were forced to sell the house for a pittance and were taken in by a local church, their fate beyond that point lost to history. The gold had been saved, but the family it was meant for was not. The house had kept its promise, holding the secret safe, but its owner was gone forever. The final paragraph of the letter was a postscript, a message written across the decades to an unknown reader. It was a plea. Klaus wrote that if this letter was ever found, it meant his plan had failed and that he was gone. He asked that whoever found his life savings not see it as a mere treasure to be squandered. He asked them to understand that it was the product of a lifetime of hard work and the physical embodiment of his love for his family. He hoped it would be used to build something, to create a new beginning, to provide a foundation for a life of purpose and security, just as he had intended it for his own children. It was a final desperate prayer from a dying man, a hope that his legacy of love would not be in vain, that it would fall into the hands of someone who understood its true worth. Marcus held the fragile paper, the German script blurring through the tears that now streamed freely down his face. The sob that had shaken him upon first seeing the gold was nothing compared to this. This was a deep, soul-cleansing grief, a wave of sorrow and gratitude so immense it felt as if his heart would break. He was crying not for the money, but for Klaus Richter and his lost family. He was crying for his own parents, for the life that had been stolen from him. And he was crying with a profound, overwhelming sense of connection, the impossible realization that a stranger's act of love, performed decades ago, had reached through time to save him from a fate of certain destruction. He was not alone. He had never truly been alone. In his darkest hour, the ghost of a good man had been watching over him. He looked around the decaying parlor, at the dust motes dancing in the shafts of light, and he finally understood what his father had meant. The house had told him a story. It was a story of a man who loved his family, a story of a promise kept by wood and stone long after the man himself was gone. This house was not a ruin. It was a sanctuary, a vessel of memory and hope. The gold was not a prize he had won. It was a legacy that had been entrusted to him. It was a sacred duty. The weight of his own despair, the feeling of being a worthless, forgotten boy, began to lift, replaced by a new, quiet strength. He was not just a survivor. He was now a custodian of another man's dream. With a reverence he had never known, he carefully folded the letter and placed it, along with the worn photograph, back into its oilskin wrapping. He tucked the small package into the inner pocket of his father's vest, placing it over his heart. It felt as if he were carrying the spirit of Klaus Richter with him, a silent guardian who had passed on his torch. He looked at the chests of gold, and they were no longer just a means of escape. They were building materials. They were the foundation for a new life, not only for himself, but for others. In the profound silence of the forgotten house, 13-year-old Marcus Anthony Ferraro made a silent, solemn promise to the kind-eyed man in the photograph. He would not fail him. He would build something worthy of the sacrifice. The first step out of the darkness of the past was the hardest, a journey of several miles on foot from the decaying Victorian house to the small immigrant mission run by a man his parents had spoken of with deep respect. He found Father Patrick O'Malley serving soup to a line of weary men, his face etched with a kindness that seemed to radiate a tangible warmth. Marcus waited, clutching the single gold coin he had taken as proof, and when he finally told his story, the priest listened with an unwavering, solemn attention. There was no disbelief in the old man's eyes, only a profound sadness for what the boy had endured and a fierce, protective resolve. That afternoon, Marcus was no longer a ghost on the streets. He was under the care of a man who saw not a runaway, but the son of a family he had mourned, a boy who desperately needed a champion. Father O'Malley immediately brought him to the office of Samuel Goldstein, a lawyer known throughout the immigrant communities for his sharp mind and his unshakable integrity. Mr. Goldstein examined the coin, listened to the story again, and then looked at Marcus with a piercing gaze that seemed to see right through to the core of his being. The lawyer acted with swift, decisive efficiency. He legally secured the house and its contents, and a discreet investigation confirmed the story of Klaus Richter. There were no living heirs. By right of discovery, the entire $53,000 fortune belonged to Marcus Anthony Ferraro. For the first time, Marcus felt the solid ground of the law beneath his feet, a system that, in the right hands, could protect the vulnerable instead of enabling the cruel. The world was beginning to reorder itself around a new center of gravity: hope. The news of the fortune inevitably reached Vincenzo Ferraro, who appeared at the lawyer's office with a greedy, triumphant gleam in his eyes, demanding his rightful share as Marcus's legal guardian. He was met, not with negotiation, but with the cold, unassailable facts of his own cruelty. Mr. Goldstein calmly presented meticulously gathered evidence, sworn statements from other laundry workers about Marcus's unpaid labor, financial records detailing the inheritance Vincenzo had stolen and gambled away, and a signed confession from the creditor Gallo outlining the $50 deal to sell Marcus to the Grey Mill. Vincenzo's blustering faded into a pale, terrified silence as he was arrested for fraud, child exploitation, and indentured servitude. The door that closed on his uncle's future was the same one that opened fully onto Marcus's own. With Mr. Goldstein managing the funds and Father O'Malley providing guidance, Marcus began the slow, deliberate process of bringing the Victorian house back to life. He did not simply hire workers. He sought out the finest immigrant craftsmen, Italian stonemasons, German woodworkers, Irish plasterers, men who, like his father, took pride in their craft. He spent hours on site, learning from them, his hands touching the wood and stone, feeling the house transform from a skeleton of decay into a vibrant, breathing home. Each restored floorboard, each new pane of glass, was an act of healing, not just for the building but for himself. He was honoring the legacy of Klaus Richter by breathing life back into the structure that had guarded his hope, and honoring his own father by valuing the substance and skill of honest work. The house was not to be a private mansion. Marcus, with a clarity of purpose that belied his age, knew it had to be a sanctuary. It was reborn as the Ferraro boarding house, a safe, clean, and welcoming haven for newly arrived immigrant families struggling to find their footing in a new world. He hired a kind but firm widow, Mrs. Adelaide Rossi, to serve as the home's governess, and she became his legal guardian, providing the steady, maternal presence he had so deeply missed. Under her care, he left the world of labor behind and returned to school, his sharp, curious mind finally free to learn. He was no longer an orphan surviving in the shadows, but a young man with a home, a purpose, and a community built on the foundations of shared hope. Years passed. The boy who had once washed his face in a public fountain became a young man who walked the halls of a university. At the age of 24, Marcus Anthony Ferraro graduated with a degree in architecture. He never sold the boarding house, which remained a beacon of hope on the city's north side. Instead, he became one of Pittsburgh's most respected restoration specialists, a man with an almost preternatural ability to see the hidden potential in the city's forgotten, decaying buildings. He dedicated his life to finding the value in the structures and the people that society had written off as worthless, forever guided by the lessons of two fathers. One, a tailor who taught him that true worth is in how something is made, and the other, a ghost who taught him that the greatest treasures are the hopes we leave behind for others to find.